Hello and welcome to this special RSPB Scotland event for Orkney Nature Festival. I'm delighted to be joined by an old friend of mine, Anne Cleeves. Hello, Anne.
Hiya.
How are you doing today?
Fine. It's good. It's quite a down day today. I've had a busy few days, but this is lovely. So it's great just to be able to have a bit of time to talk to you.
Excellent. And is the sun shining where you are?
A bit grey and gloomy, but it's all right. It's a bit chilly wind, but
Well, I must be in the right place for once because it's absolutely beautiful here in Orkney today. It's been a bit of a mixed week, but of course there is always the wind. But
yeah, I wish I was there with you.
yeah, it's been a while since we've been able to catch up. A pandemic got in the way of that, but hopefully sometime soon you'll be able to make a return trip to Orkney.
Oh, I hope so.
So we've got lots to talk about. Obviously, as a published author for fast approaching 40 years, something like that.
Yeah.
There's lots to talk about, but we'll maybe take a wee trip back in time first. So tell me a bit, if you will, about the young Anne Cleeves. Were you a country girl when you were growing up?
Yeah, very much. My dad was a village school teacher, so we lived first of all in Herefordshire in a little village, tiny hamlet called Adverton, which had nothing really, farms and a church and a chapel and this tiny school that had 30 kids in it.
Right.
15 infants, 15 juniors. I mean, it could have been an island school.
Yeah.
And but it's not much fun if your dad's the head teacher, you know.
I can imagine.
I don't think I was invited out to tea very often.
Yeah.
So I think that started a love of the country, obviously, but also that sense of being a bit of an outsider and looking in, an observer rather than a participant, which is what you need as a writer. So, yeah, that's where we started off.
Yeah. And did you have siblings? Did you have people to play with when you were growing
I did.
up?
I had a younger sister.
Okay.
But I think when you're sort of 7 or 8, 3 years is quite a big gap. So yeah, we did our own things, but we did play together too.
Yeah. And was that love of nature? Did you appreciate when you were growing up what you had surrounding you, or you look back now and sort of realize how lucky you were?
No, I think I always did love it. I think not. I mean, I knew very little about it, but I loved almost even then the sort of romanticism of it, of the hills and the trees, and just a real emotional response to it. Loved being there.
Yeah. And it would have been good for developing your author's imagination, that landscape and what you're experiencing.
Yeah, I think so. And I can remember I loved Malcolm Savile's books, and he wrote kind of Enid Blyton, but a lot better written.
Okay.
And he set his books in very close to where we were living then. And I can remember writing to him and telling him how much I loved his books and getting a handwritten letter back.
Excellent.
And being absolutely thrilled.
Yeah.
And I've spoken to other crime writers who were also fans as youngsters. So Mick Heron, who writes the Jackson Lamb books, and Ellie Griffiths were, like me, members of the Lone Pine Club, which was his club for young readers.
Yeah. Oh, excellent. So I cut to a few years later then, and you headed off to uni. I know that you're a uni dropout. What were you studying?
Yeah, I was studying English and just hated university. I think it was everybody being crowded in together. I was in Sussex University, and so because there were lots of guest houses in Brighton, they stuck us in these guest houses and just packed us in because it was quite a new university and there wasn't much campus accommodation. And just feeling very, I'd really enjoyed school. I had a brilliant time in the sixth form. By that point, that they closed that tiny school in Herefordshire and we'd moved down to North Devon, and I just loved it. I'm still in touch with some of the people I was at school with. It was the beaches and it was, parties in the sand dunes and all that. And university was a real letdown after that. And so, yeah, I didn't get on with it. It was all right. I did the coursework was okay.
Yeah.
And I was really arrogant. I'd done a gap year between school and university, looking after doing sort of social work type stuff. And I just thought it was self-indulgent to be sitting around talking about poetry. And I could read books anywhere. So
Yeah.
what was I doing in this place that I didn't particularly enjoy? Yeah, so I dropped out of university.
And so then the obvious answer to what you could do instead was head off to Fair Isle. How did that come about?
Yeah, that was so many of my career choices have been by chance, really. That was a chance meeting in a pub in Putney, because I'd done this gap year working with social services in London.
Yeah.
And they took me back for, you know, as a proper employee. But again, I'm not really a city person. And sitting in this pub, and a friend of a friend was moaning because he was going up to Shetland to be assistant warden on Fair Isle, and it was a cold and miserable place, and he wasn't sure he wanted to go. And I don't know, he was going to miss his girlfriend, and, you know, this sort of whinging male type thing.
Oh, yeah.
as only young men can. And so I said something like, well, I wouldn't mind spending a summer on Fair Isle. And he said, well, if you're serious, they're desperate for an assistant cook. So I went, gave up work. Didn't even know where Fair Isle was at that point, Stuart. Didn't have a clue. Thought it might be one of the Western Isles.
And I was reading your book about Shetland, the non-fiction book you did, and you said that you went to Fair Isle to be assistant cook at the Bird Observatory, despite not being able to cook and knowing nothing about birds.
Absolutely.
In at the deep end.
They must have been desperate, but the warden, who I'm still in contact with every now and again, he had a 3-year-old and his wife was pregnant, and because it had been childcare that I was doing in London, I do wonder if that might have been more important than the cooking skills, that I might be around to help with Adam, the little boy, when the baby was coming. So,
yeah, so you were multitasking in that job. I read in the book a few bits about you were out like helping with the bird ringing and such like as well. Was it really just a case of get stuck into whatever was going on?
Oh yeah, I loved Fair Isle. It's still my place of sanctuary where I would go back after my husband died. Very soon after, I went back and stayed in Fair Isle with a good friend, and it is just, there is something much. I love all islands, but there is something special about Fair Isle. Yeah, and I was so seasick when I arrived. We're in on that dreadful boat, the Good Shepherd. Threw up about 2 minutes after leaving Grutness at the south of Shetland, and carried on throwing up until I arrived. But that didn't put you off? Did you think, what the hell have I done? No, all these lovely faces, because everyone from the Isle goes down to help unload the boat when it comes in, because it's got mail and it's got everybody's supplies really and stuff for the shop. And just from that moment, I loved it. Had such a good time there. Yeah. And how far north in Scotland had you been before you went to Fair Isle? I don't think I've been to Scotland at all. At all? No, it was a rude awake thing. It was, because I'd been living in North Devon, you know, so when they said the boat will pick you up at the pier, I was imagining somewhere, you know, pretty with tea shops and, well, there's nothing at Grutness. There's a kind of bus shelter. Yeah. And I think that's been put up since my time. Okay. I haven't been to Fair Isle. I remember back probably mid-80s when there were, I don't know if it lasted very long, you could fly from Orkney to Fair Isle, and I remember my parents doing that, and I was forced to stay at home, so I haven't made it yet. But we'll get you in, Stuart. We'll get you there. But then, given that I only got to Pappy for the first time about a month ago, and I grew up in Westray, and you've even been to Pappy before I have, so I'm not doing very well. Yeah. And of course, in Fair Isle, that's where you met Tim. Yeah, he came as a visiting bird watcher. Came in the autumn for the migration and the rare birds, and he was from the West Country too. He was from Bristol, So I called in to see him on my way home when I finished my stint there.
So it was a seasonal role. What was your what time
Finished
did you do
in
there?
November, but not because I was still cooking for birders, but because Judy, the warden's wife, had gone off and had a baby, so I was there just sort of helping out a bit with Adam and with the children.
Okay. Yeah. So you left Fair Isle as a couple with Tim, and the rest was history.
Well, kind of, yeah. He came back, but as we're talking to our SPB stuff, at that point he had quite a good job. He was working as a credit controller for a firm that supplied carpets. So I thought, he was not a bad catch, really.
Yeah.
Because I had no prospects at all, being a university dropout and not terribly good observatory cook. So I thought, he was all right. But then he told me about 3 months later that he'd given up his job doing that, and he got a seasonal job with the RSPB.
Okay.
Yeah, which carried on. He carried on having these seasonal posts, and then after we married, I said he was looking after birds of prey in mid Wales, and I said something like, "But where will we live?" And he said, "Oh, I think they give you a caravan."
And what did you think to that?
Oh, you're young, you can do anything. It wasn't a caravan. It was the first thing they offered us was this hovel in the hills, which was fine, except we were supposed to share it with these 3 male survey workers. We were a week married.
That's not ideal.
We did find somewhere for ourselves. Somebody, a lovely family took pity on us, and they had quite rather a nice house at Kerry. They gave us a flat at the top of the house.
So Tim was a big birder. Did his enthusiasm for birds rub off on you as the years went past?
No, not at all. I mean, I know a bit now because it seeped in through osmosis, and we did have fun when he was working in Wales. This was before mobile phones, and we used to go out. I've been doing almost like investigation stuff with the investigations team. So I can remember being sitting outside a phone box somewhere miles from anywhere with this van registration number, and if I saw it go past, I was supposed to phone the police because it was someone who was coming to steal peregrine chicks.
Okay.
So that was our weekend. That was quite fun and all that.
Yeah.
That fed into some of the later books.
Well, I was going to say, having reread some of the virus, that sort of topics that were being touched on in the books as well. So yeah, lots of inspiration for your writing career.
Yeah.
So were you pretty much in Fair Isle when you were there? Did you get a chance to go and explore other parts of Shetland, or did that come later?
No, the first time I did get a holiday week off, and one of the guys who was working on the island lent me a camper van. So went off in this VW caravanette. So did get to see a little bit of Shetland mainland.
Yeah. And
yeah, I was there again. I better put some bird stuff in, hadn't I? As this is the RSPB. I was there when they were ringing the snowy owl chicks. So I have stroked a baby snowy owl.
And there's probably not that many people can say that.
Say that, yeah.
And you mentioned in this Shetland book, which I recommend people check out if you haven't. It's just absolutely full of amazing photography. Was this?
Yeah.
It was a
Shetlander who did the photography. It was
it's a fantastic looking book. There's all sorts of things in there, so definitely well worth looking at. But you mentioned things like Fair Isle for the size of the place. It's had more rare birds than anywhere else, so equivalent size in the UK. And I thought this book was really full of lots of snippets of facts that made me. I love it when a book inspires you to go and do a bit more research because you get a tiny bit of
no, Fair Isle is famous. People come from all over the world to see the migrants in September and in the spring, but mostly September, October. And it was fine when the winds were in the right, if it was a southeasterly wind and there was a bit of fog and all the migrants dropped in and there were really rare birds and people were adding to their list, brilliant. If there were westerly gales, they would just sit in the observatory common room, drink beer and do things like play bird name Scrabble. And again, a lot more whinging. But it was so rough and so wild that you couldn't even go out and lift a pair of binoculars. It was so miserable.
And if a rare bird did appear and everybody was getting excited, did you go off and have a look as well?
Yeah, sometimes just because it was quite fun to tell people who came a week later, oh yeah, imaculated, like I've seen one of those, Siberian ruby throat. They're quite bonny. Sat in the kitchen garden for quite a long time. Yeah, that's called gripping people off.
You could be saying any bird name to me because being so new to RSPB, I am not afraid to admit that I have a huge amount to learn about birds. But what I found is that everybody on the team and anybody I've encountered is so enthusiastic and so willing to share their knowledge. Is that what you found as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, really. And I think it brings the countryside alive a bit if you do know a bit about what you're hearing and what you're seeing. It gives it an extra texture and an extra depth. Yeah,
definitely. I think life is so much richer if you can see things and you know what they are, or it's all about, I think, just opening your eyes and paying attention to your surroundings. I had some just house sparrows at the feeder the other day, and actually getting the binoculars out and looking at these house sparrows and seeing what they look like close up.
Yeah,
and it's just a completely different experience. So yeah, I'm really enjoying increasing.
And this time of the year, noticing the wheat years coming. I did a long walk up in Northumberland, and a couple of years ago I was so proud of myself because I found a ring ouzel up on the crags, and knowing what it it gave me quite a buzz, really.
Yeah. And although you're not a birder, you mentioned sometimes things can take your breath away. Like in the book, you mentioned seeing the hundreds of snow buntings.
Yeah.
And
I don't think anybody could fail to be impressed by that. They look like snowflakes, don't they? If it's nearly dusk and they're there sort of swooping in and out, they're just beautiful.
Yeah. So then after Fair Isle, probably you were there in 75, and I think your first book came out in 86. What was the sort of the intervening years?
Well, 75, 76, I was on Fair Isle. I came back and did another season.
Okay.
And then we got married the following February, which had been 77. And Tim got a job on Hilbury, which is a little nature reserve in the mouth of the Dee between the Wirral and North Wales.
Okay.
And it was tiny. It was only 11 acres, a tidal island. So when the tide was out, you could walk across the sand and the rocks to get there. We were the only residents. We lived in an old telegraph house, no mains electricity, no mains water. Yeah, and if you're not into birds, and I'm really, as I've explained, not, then there wasn't much to do. At that point, though, I was training to be a probation officer. I was doing my social work training. So I had this schizophrenic existence where I'd plodge out before the tide in my oilskins and wellies. And then the council had given me this hut on West Kirby Prom, which I think had the mini golf clubs and things kept in it. And so I had a key to that. I'd go in and come out like Wonder Woman, dressed for court or dressed to go and go to the office to do a placement. So I did my 2 years training while we were on Hilbury, which was a bit mad. And then I worked for a little bit, and then I was pregnant. So I decided that I wasn't going to do any more traipsing across the sand and the rock.
I think that's why.
And that's when I started writing.
Yeah. On
the island, no interruptions.
And
gave the excuse not to be whitewashing the house or.
Yeah. So sorry, I'm busy writing. I can't possibly do that.
Yeah.
So how long was it then before you started approaching publishers or looking for an agent? How did the process work?
I think I finished it it takes a long time to write a first book, I think, because you're just not sure how it works and what's going to happen. And so we'd moved back to the mainland, I think, by the time I even started looking. And I think Susan Hill had a book program on Radio 4, and I think they had a competition for a first novel, which I entered. I didn't come anywhere close, but because of the competition, that made me finish the book. I wanted to get it finished in time to enter it, and did that. And then I was left with this very poorly typed manuscript. And I just went to the library and looked and saw who published the sort of book that I'd written, and sent off a couple of letters. And a couple of them wanted to see the script. And then I think the fourth letter I got back accepted it, which was bizarre. I mean, it would never, ever happen these days. These days you need an agent and you need to know what you're doing.
Whereas you just needed a trip to the library, and what more can you say? That's the power of libraries for you.
That's right. So so it came out early '86.
And that was A Bird in the Hand. That was the first. So how did you arrive at the idea for the characters, George and Molly Palmer-Jones? I must say it's an absolutely genius idea to have a birder as a lead character, because you can take them all over the country, all over the world. That I think that's a great idea.
I think George was very much based on a professor of Liverpool University, who I think he was still working when we first moved to Hilbury, but I'd met him first on Fair Isle. He'd come to Fair Isle. So I knew him from there. And he was elderly, very brainy. You know, he'd been this professor of nuclear physics, I think, but really into his birding. And his wife, Dorothy, was feminist, wore a lab coat instead of a dressing gown, smoked a pipe. They were just a wonderful couple, and so hospitable. And they would put me up if I couldn't get back to the island because of the tide. They would put me up. And I think he came from that. But killing a birder probably came from being stuck on that island with Tim. You know, it saved our marriage. I think killing a young birder was fairly important.
Yeah, I did chuckle, because I think I had read maybe one or two of the series, but I have read them all in preparation for this. And when the first victim in the very first book is a young birder, that did make me smile.
But
so
it was they were fun to. I mean, now I would look back at them and sort of wince, but because it's my 30th year of being published by Pan Macmillan, they wanted to do something to celebrate. So they are reprinting those early books. So they will be available if people want to have a look at them.
It's really interesting, because in the lead up to this, I've mentioned to a few people that I'm talking to you, and I'm going to be talking about this series. It's interesting how many people who I would think are Anne Cleeves fans are completely unaware that these books exist. I guess they're quite tricky to get a hold of if you don't have a local library.
I think they were. You can get them on Kindle possibly, or print on demand. But though they are going to be very lovely new books.
Excellent.
So that'll be quite fun. Though people have to read them with a certain amount of understanding that I was a very new writer when I wrote them. I'm very influenced, I think, by golden age fiction, crime fiction. You know, he is an amateur sleuth, and he's quite wealthy, and he's quite posh. You know, he's got a double barrel name. I thought that's what crime fiction was about in those days, because I don't think I'd read much contemporary crime fiction. Maybe some P.D. James, but she's got quite a posh detective as well. So. And
the rest, I think there's sort of the obvious comparisons to Agatha Christie, in that by being a birder, they can drop into these various small villages or whatever. That there's certain things that as I was reading, I was like, oh yeah, this is quite Christie like. But I think the books, over the course of, I think it was 8 books he did over the 10 years in the series, and I think they they change as it develops as well? Was that because you were maybe reading more crime fiction, or
yeah, I
adapting what
think
you wrote as it
so.
went along?
And you hope that you're going to get a bit better with practice as well, don't you? So, and I think crime fiction in general was changing, because the first books are very slight, they're very slender, and lots of crime fiction was then, you know, it wasn't unusual to get books with 65, 70,000 words. That was the sort of norm. And then as time progressed, and maybe it didn't cost any more, the printing didn't cost any more as it got more technical, that we were encouraged to write longer books and to
And how were your early books? How would they have been pitched? What would the genre have been? And then just general crime, or would it was cozy crime even a
I don't
phrase
think it
used then?
was. No, I don't think there was. And I know that we sent a copy of A Bird in the Hand to Bill Oddie, and he really loved it and was prepared to give us a quote for the back. So that was quite nice.
Brilliant.
I remember getting the phone call from him saying, yeah, I loved it. I'll say something nice about it.
Excellent. So that'll be going on the cover of the reprints.
I don't know if it will.
Did you ever get the quote? And in A Prey to Murder, published in 1989, the dedication at the start of the book says, for the wardens, volunteers and RSPB members who helped to protect wild birds of prey. Was that partly Tim's influence there?
No, it was me remembering, I think, those early days when he was a contract warden for the RSPB, and just the fun that we had, you know, camping out on the cliff path in Pembrokeshire to try and warden some of the peregrines then. And I think that the number of red kites in Wales was tiny in those days, so it was almost literally just sitting under a tree to make sure that nobody was climbing up it.
And there was lots. So the books touch on lots of different sort of aspects that impact on bird life and nature, like the use of pesticides and poison being used for the raptors and killing birds of prey, and environmental policies. So you were touching on lots of sort of more meaty areas, although it might have initially been seen as quite sort of light crime fiction.
Yeah, because that was what I was living with, you know. Those were the conversations that I was hearing. Because Tim did get a permanent job with the RSPB, and we were in the Midlands for a bit when he was assistant regional officer. But then the big move came, the best move came when we moved to the northeast, where he was conservation officer. And just fell in love with northeast England and the space and Northumberland and the wildness of it. And so that was the big move, really.
And that's been your home ever since?
Yeah, we got exiled to West Yorkshire for 7 years when Tim shifted job for a bit, but we knew we'd come back. This was always where we were going to be.
So I was hoping you might do a reading for me from one of the Pamela Jones novels. This is, I think, the 5th book in the series, published in 1991, Sea Fever. I thought this extract maybe give a little taste of what the readers can expect.
And this was written while we were up here, because there was a very rare seabird called a swinhouse petrel was caught. They were catching storm petrels off a beach in Tynemouth, and got this bird and nobody knew what it was. And eventually it was tracked down as a swinhouse petrel. But that was what triggered this novel. Because it caused so much excitement. Even if there had been no murder, the last trip of the season of the Jessie Ellen would have been news. A new bird for the world, after all, is rather special. There would undoubtedly have been interviews with specialist reporters, speculations about where the bird could possibly breed, sponsorship perhaps for an expedition to track it down to a cliff in some lonely and uninhabited island. There was, George felt all along, a relationship between the murder of the boy and the sighting of a storm petrel never before recorded. He wasn't so superstitious that he considered the death as a cause of the appearance of the bird. It was no sacrifice to the forces of nature. Neither did he see the petrel as an albatross bringing misfortune and disaster with its astounding beauty. Yet he thought that if the bird had never appeared, flying so close to the boat that they could make a plan of its wing formula and see the colour of the webs of its feet, Greg Franks would still be alive. Certainly the boy's death spoiled the bird for them. They hated him, as if it were his fault, because the elation and joy which should have lasted for weeks was cut short, and the fame they deserved was denied to them. George Palmer Jones met Greg Franks first at Holywell Pond, the Northumberland Wildlife Trust Reserve. The memory of the meeting was strangely vivid, though there had been many such incidents in his birdwatching career. Afterwards, when other rare birds turned up, he looked out for Greg and noticed him. Despite that, when Mr. and Mrs. Franks hired him to trace the missing son, he didn't at first connect them with the boy who had disturbed the Balon's crake at Holywell. When he did, the memory of the day returned to him, sharp and complete, as if it had only happened minutes before. It had been early June, a hot and sticky day with the threat of thunder, and swallows flying low over yellow rape fields. The field by the pond was waist high with buttercups, clover and cow parsley. George arrived at the hide overlooking the pond at lunchtime to discover that the bird hadn't been seen that day. It was probably skulking in the reed bed, said the exultant locals who had found the bird. It often did that. The hide was full of people crammed together along the bench seat waiting. There was a smell of hot creosote and damp vegetation. They talked occasionally, but their attention was on the still water. They were prepared to wait until evening. Just be patient, said the locals. It came out at dusk yesterday. It won't have gone anywhere. Then Greg burst into the hide. He seemed physically incapable of patience. He paced across the wooden floor, smoking one cigarette after another, and his restlessness was so obvious, so flamboyant, that he unsettled all the others there. I want some action, he said at last. I'm going in. I need this bird. Don't be a fool, man, said one of the locals, a big, square person with hands like spades. You'll scare it off. Then no one will see it. This is a nature reserve. Do you think the trust will put out news of other rarities if you go tramping all over it? He stood up to confront Greg, blocking his way, and George thought there might be a fight. But Greg was too quick for them. He slipped out of the hide and onto the reserve. They saw his sleek black head moving like a stoat's through the reed bed. A moorhen gave an alarm call and splashed into view. In the hide there was silence. Suddenly the crake was in the open, flying. It was so close to the hide that they couldn't focus their binoculars on it. The bird flew around the pond once more, and they thought it would settle again at the edge of the water to give more prolonged views, but it changed direction and disappeared very quickly in the heat haze. Greg Franks must have tripped in the reed bed because he stood up to wave his arms triumphantly at them. He was dripping wet and his hair straggled like seaweed across his face. When he returned to the hide, George was surprised by the reception the boy received. The bird had been frightened off by an act of stupid exhibitionism, yet the watchers were indulgent, as if Greg was a spoilt but gifted child who should be allowed his own way. They had, of course, obtained brilliant if fleeting views of the bird. The bird watchers who arrived later in the afternoon were less understanding and threatened unimaginable tortures to Franks if they should catch him. In the following year, George Palmer Jones saw Greg several times. He was on Scilly for most of October and seemed suddenly to be at every new bird. Recently, George saw he had taken to driving a maroon Mercedes with American number plates. He usually had a group of friends with him, wild young men like himself and pretty girls. There were rumours that he made his money through drug dealing or theft or some vaguely illegal deals with friends in the city. He always seemed to have money, and he was always one of the first to arrive at a rarity, but no one seemed too concerned about what lay behind his apparent affluence. Birdwatching is full of eccentrics. They were more interested in his list. The subject of Greg Franks' list was brought up wherever the more avid twitchers gathered together. It must be immense, they said. Now he went for everything. Surely it must rival the older twitchers who had those blockers from the 60s. Surely by now it must be as big as Roger Pym's. George wasn't one of those for whom the speculation about lists is as important as seeing the birds themselves. And when he and his wife were hired by Mr. and Mrs. Franks to trace their missing son, he made no connection with Greg. It was more than a year after the visit to Holywell Pond. The first contact was by phone, and George took the call. Yes, he said, Palmer Jones. The woman on the other end had a Bristol accent and her voice was breathless and shaky with nerves. That is Mr. Palmer Jones, the private detective. He hated the term, but she was so anxious already that he could only say, how can I help you? Then in an incoherent stream of words, she pleaded with him to visit her and Mr. Franks at home. They were desperate and the problem was too difficult, she said, too personal to discuss on the telephone. It was midsummer, a quiet time for work and for birding, and George agreed to go and see them.
There's a lot going on there.
There is a lot going on there.
I'm sure that will definitely inspire a few people to go and check out this series.
I'm not sure whether twitching is a thing still, because it was so big, and there were so many young people who did it when Tim was younger. But I don't know if people still so avid to see so many to get a new bird for the list. There are still some birders from here who travel. Yeah, I think.
And it's obvious that there's a, for reading the books in the series, that there's a definite sort of hierarchy of birders as well. And as you did such a lovely reading for me, I'm going to read you a bit from the same novel, talking about this Greg Franks, who was the murder victim. This is what one of the other characters said about him. He was not the sort of bird watcher I approve of. He probably wouldn't have even called himself a bird watcher. He would say he was a birder or a lister. Dreadful Americanisms. He didn't know very much about common birds. These youngsters move on to rarities too quickly, in my opinion. They don't put in the groundwork. I love that there's these sort of levels of disapproval amongst other the birders.
It was very interesting. When I was doing my social work diploma, we had to do a study of a subculture, and I did birders because they were very interesting. You know, they had their own jargon, talking about gripping off and so it was quite interesting to look at that, at birders as a collective. And I'm not sure what it's like now at all, because I'm out of the loop.
Well, give me a few more months and I can update you once I've had a bit more experience. So these the Palmer Jones novels came out over a period of 10 years, but you also had the Inspector Ramsay books started coming out as well. Why did you decide to launch a second series? Did you just fancy trying something different? Did you want to have an actual policeman rather than a private investigator?
Yeah, I don't think it was that really. It was moving to the northeast, and we did live in the village of Holywell, where Holywell Pond is. And Holywell was very pretty and quite close to the coast, but it had once been a pit village. And so there were lots of former miners, very close, very friendly. You know, we moved in, and after I knew within half an hour that I'd love it there, because the neighbour was in with tea and biscuits, and I got all the gossip. I knew everyone in the street by the end of that half hour, and just loved that. I'm thinking that because I wrote those sort of golden age, really, traditional crime fiction, you couldn't set a story in a village in the south of England anymore, I think, not with the twitching net curtains, because it would be full of people who were commuting to London or who worked in tech. If they were living in one of the pretty cottages, you know, it would be, you wouldn't have that sort of close sense of community. And we certainly had that in Holywell. I can remember I'd been in hospital and was walking the kids to school, and this elderly woman who I'd never seen before in my life hurtled out of her house and, "Hey Pet, I'm so sorry to hear you've been poorly." How did she know? You know, sort of strange. But I loved it. I loved that.
Yeah. And then Vera came along,
And
and
Vera came along.
that was in 1999. The first Vera book came out, The Crow Trap. There was quite a gap then between the first Vera and the second one. Didn't come out until 2005. Did you know that Vera was going to be a series when you wrote, or was that a one-off as far as
No,
you were concerned?
it was almost like a commission, that one, though I wasn't paid in advance at all. But I had a very new young editor who had decided that nobody was going to read traditional crime fiction anymore. And what they really wanted was very big psychological suspense novels. And she suggested that I write one of these. And it definitely wasn't going to be a series, and it really shouldn't have a detective in it. So I had this idea for an environmental survey happening up in the Northumberland National Park before the creation of a huge quarry, and that there would be 3 women who were doing the survey, looking at, you know, throwing out quadrats as they do, and looking at the botany and the zoology and the bird life. And so that's how it started. And I got stuck about a third of the way through and didn't know what, because I never plot in advance.
Yeah.
And I think it was Raymond Chandler who said, if you're stuck with a book, have a door burst open and a guy come in with a gun. I don't really do guns because it would take too much research. So I was writing a funeral scene, and I did have the door open, and in came Vera Stanhope, and I had her name and described her as looking more like a bag lady than a detective, and that she's got all the papers about the case in a Tesco's carrier bag, and so that's how she came into it.
Yeah,
And
it's quite late in the novel before she arrives, and having gone back to reread it, it feels like a very different work for the Vera novels that we're reading that you've published recently. It has a complete, these days, I guess, because everybody has such a poor attention span now, you need to have the action happening within the first few pages of a novel, but that was quite a slow burn.
Yeah, it was a long book, and I still quite like the book, but it was, and poor Brenda, when she got offered the part of Vera, they sent her The Crow Trap, and apparently she got in touch with them and said, I thought I was going to be the star of this. When does she come in?
So that would have had to been rewritten when they did it on the telly.
Oh yeah, the script was quite different. But so it was going to be a standalone. It was going to be a standalone novel, and it didn't sell terribly well. But the young editor married a music journalist and went off to Australia. So eventually I could go back and pick up the series again.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I'd written The Sleeping and the Dead, which is a standalone, Burial of Ghosts, which is a standalone, and I think the first Shetland book, and then was able to go back to Vera.
Yeah, and the format of Vera, again, is quite flexible because the stories can be very urban or very rural or a mixture of both. I really like that. And again, you touch on lots of themes in Vera, like the eggs being stolen and sold, and again the birds of prey being persecuted and such. Like there's lots of the elements of nature that you bring into the work.
Yeah, well, at that point, as I said, Tim was conservation officer for the RSPB in the north of England. And we did have survey workers who would come and stay with us after they'd been in the hills, you know, to be debriefed or to just get a good meal and before going south. And so I was listening to those sort of conversations, I suppose.
Yeah, so you were writing about what you know, or what you were picking up for the conversations that you were hearing.
Yeah, what was rumbling on in the background at home.
And I guess when the first Vera books are coming out, did you have any sort of aspirations that it might make a TV series? Did
Absolutely
that
not
ever cross your mind?
No, because I was a real low lister in those days. You know, I was right at the bottom of the heap. As I say, I wasn't paid in advance. I wasn't under any form of contract. Every book I had to write on spec and just hope that they'd take it.
Yeah.
And still at that point. And in fact, the Crow Trap sold very poorly, partly because they forgot to put it in the catalogue, and before digital selling, it didn't really help. But because of that, there were lots of remaindered copies knocking around, and one of them ended up in an Oxfam shop in Crouch End, and it was Elaine Collins picking it up to go on holiday that got Vera on the telly, because that was so. In the end, although it didn't sell well, it was very lucky for me.
Yeah, so just one of these strokes of luck that have probably really helped transform your career. Where in your career did the time come where you became a full-time writer? When did you start selling to well enough that you thought, I can do this and make a living from it?
That was 2006, when Raven Black won the Gold Dagger. And for the first time ever, I think, money came with the prize, because it was sponsored by a private bank, the Duncan Lowry Bank. And so they put a bit of prize money in. And I think it was 20 grand, which was, you know, it was a nice sum.
Yeah, absolutely.
Still a nice sum. And it was what my annual salary was. So I thought, well, yeah, I can give it a year anyway.
Yeah.
And at that time, we were thinking about moving back to the Northeast. So that all happened at that time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
we'll maybe talk a wee bit more about the Shetland novels in a second, but I was hoping you might give me a wee reading for the Crow Trap as well before we move on.
I can do that. Saved here. Vera Stanhope sat on the plaid rug on the grass in front of Bakey's, gulped champagne, and remembered quite clearly the last time she had seen Constant Bakey alive. She was tempted to recount the event to Rachel and Edie because she knew they liked to hear her stories. Perhaps the taste in her mouth brought back the scene so vividly because they'd been drinking champagne that day too. Oh, Constance was so ill that they had to hold the glass for her. They had propped her up on the sofa with pillows, but by then she was so large that her flesh spread, jelly-like, over the edge of it, and she looked in danger of overbalancing and falling off. Vera had come to the cottage with her father. She'd driven him in her car because by that time he was getting on too. The week before, she'd been working nights and she was exhausted. A day with her father always sapped her energy. But he'd been determined to make the trip, and even then, towards the end of his life, he could impose his will on her. Perhaps she didn't want him to visit Connie on his own. It wasn't only that she was concerned for his safety, she was worried about what he might get up to, because her father had been an addict. She hadn't explained that to the women when she told stories about her childhood in the hills. She hadn't described her growing understanding of what her father was really after when he took her walking, when he pointed out the nests of skylarks and wheatears, made her watch the peregrine swooping on its prey. Her father had been an inveterate and compulsive stealer of Burke's eggs, not the way that a school child might be. For him, it was an obsession and a business. It had funded his retirement. She had come to realise as a child that she was there as a cover. At dangerous sites protected by wardens and electric fences, he had even sent her in to steal the eggs. It wouldn't have done for an ambitious young detective to see her father in court in contravention of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, so she never liked him going into the hills on his own. He swore he had given up collecting, but she never believed a word he said. Addicts always lied. And even if it were true on his own account, Connie Bakey had always been able to twist him round her little finger. She shared his compulsion. She might be too old and sick to get into mischief now, but Hector, Vera's father, was devoted and would have done anything for the woman. The champagne had been his idea. A treat for the old girl, he had said. Vera had thought he knew Connie was dying and especially wanted to keep her sweet because he had an eye on her collection. His own was extensive enough. It was kept in locked mahogany cases, each egg held safely in a nest of cotton wool in the spare room, hidden inside an ugly wardrobe. Vera was supposed not to know about this secret, though most nights he'd shut himself into the room like a dirty old man with a hoard of porn. Connie's collection he had leered at and salivated over openly since Vera was a child, even after the Wildlife Act had been kept in full view. Occasionally, Connie saw Vera looking at the display cabinets. They're quite legal, she'd say, coughing and panting to get out the words, defying Vera to contradict her. Collected before the act was passed. Vera, though, had seen new trays added and would have investigated the origins of the collection if it hadn't been for the Hector connection. Better not to know.
I love that tension between Vera's past life and the detective, the way those two things sort of jar up against each other.
Yeah.
But I guess she deals with that in the book, sort of how much she loved her father, but recognizing the flaws in his character and the dodgy dealings he was involved in.
Yeah, and she'd been an neglected child, really, an unloved child, because she just got in his way. And yeah, it's quite a sad relationship, I think.
Yeah. So obviously Vera continues to be a huge success both in books and on TV. There's a new Vera out this year, I believe.
Yeah, September the 1st, a new Vera called The Rising Tide. And yeah, that was my lockdown book. It's not really about COVID, but it's about older people having to face their own mortality. So I think it was my sitting at home brooding a bit book.
Yeah. So Vera was a success, and then you said that the book that sort of really changed your career was the Raven Black, the first Shetland novel. Had you been going back and forth to Shetland since you left Fair Isle, or was it somewhere that you visited regularly?
Yeah, not very often, but we had friends there and went to stay on Fair Isle and on the mainland. And then again, another bit of luck. Raven Black came about because a very rare bird turned up in Shetland. And it was between Christmas and New Year. And my Christmas present to Tim was that we would day trip Shetland to get him this bird. And so, you know, we drove up to Aberdeen overnight on the ferry, got in at 7 in the morning and it's pitch black. But Tim hopefully set up his telescope, but click him in loch, waiting for this bird to appear. And I went off and got breakfast. And luckily it was still there. It would have been a bit of a bummer to have gone all that way.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad he did see it.
He did see it. Yeah, it was a really, really boring bird. It was an American coot, which is very like a British coot.
Just the accent's different.
I don't know what it was. Anyway, we had the rest of the day and we spent it out with the RSPB officer, Shetland's RSPB officer, who was a great friend, who was called Pete Ellis, and who's since retired but is still in Shetland. And just it was a beautiful day. It had snowed and it was still, you know, there was no wind, and saw the ravens really black against the snow. And because I'm a crime writer, I thought, well, if there was blood as well, fabulous. And quite by chance, I went back about 6 weeks later to do some work with the library there. Because at that point, I was doing a bit of a work for an organisation called Opening the Book that trained library staff.
Yeah.
And went up and did something with the library and met the literature officer for Shetland. It was called Alec Clunas. And said, I've got this idea for a story, but I think it'll just have to be a short story because it would be an impertinence to set a novel in Shetland. And he said, no, go for it. And he introduced me to a former cop. And we just chatted and the book was written.
That was that. And then it became an award-winning book.
Yeah, then that was a real career changer because it did win the Gold Dagger and and started to sell overseas then. It took a while for the sales in the UK to pick up, but there was enough income from America and from Scandinavia to keep me ticking over.
And do you think the fact that the Shetland novels are very much rooted in the place, in the landscape, in the culture, everything, is that why you think that book series in particular did well abroad? And
I think so. And again, it's sort of luck and timing, isn't it? Because it was at a time when Scandi Noir was huge, and you can't get much more Scandi in the UK than Shetland. So, so that all just, I hadn't thought about it that way. I hadn't planned it that way, but I think reviewers hooked into it because it was different and because it did have that different setting. And for most people who've never been out of London, it must have seemed quite exotic.
And did you, each time you were working on a Shetland novel, did you make sure you had more trips then to Shetland to do your research? And
I did, and it was always read by a Shetlander before it went to press, because sometimes I made dreadful mistakes, just really crazy mistake. But so it always went to a Shetlander to read. And I don't write in dialect at all, but just to get that rhythm of speech, it's good to be there and hear people talking. And so I loads of friends, but I would always stay with Shetlanders.
And now that the Shetland novels have come to an end, after 8 books rather than the 4 that you maybe thought it was going to be initially, has Shetland now become once again a place where you can go and really relax rather than go there and also be thinking about what you need to write about next time?
And instead of looking where I'm going to kill somebody off. No, I am, but I am still very, I was up just before Christmas to open their new library, so I'm still quite involved in the bookie side of things there. And in June 2023 they're going to redo Shetland Noir, so I've been quite involved in thinking about who we might invite and who we're going to get up. And,
exciting stuff.
So you'll have to come, Stuart. You'll have to come this time.
I won't have to dress as the Gruffalo this time, will I?
You will not have to dress as a Gruffalo.
Well, that's good. So when you visit Shetland, Anne, what do you do to occupy your time there? Do you go out and see the sights and go to the beaches and up hills? How do you spend your time in Shetland?
I try and avoid up Heliar with all the people, but I love going midsummer when it's light all night and we get the boat out to Musa and look at the storm petrels coming in to breed in the old broch there.
And although you're known for Shetland, you've spent a bit of time in Orkney as well. Have you had a chance to explore much of Orkney in the times you've been here?
Again, mostly birding with Tim. So we stayed in the North Ronaldsay Bird Observatory a few times, and we were great friends with Eric Meek, who used to be the Orkney officer. So he lived in Stennis, so quite a lot of time spent there too. Very happy memories with him and Chris.
Excellent. Well, I think our Wi-Fi connection is maybe playing up a bit, so I think we'll wrap it up there. But thank you very much for spending time with me today. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and thank you for giving your time so generously for RSPB and for Orkney Nature Festival.
Lovely. I wish I was there in person. Have a great festival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne.